All right, guys, today I am here with the author of Teaching the Invisible Race, Tony DelaRosa. Tony, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me here today. My name is Tony DelaRosa. I am a anti-bias, anti-racist, decolonial educator, author of this book, Teaching the Invisible Race. I'm a PhD student at UW-Madison, Wisconsin, focusing on Asian American ed policy and how it translates into practice. And then lastly, cross-racial solidarity building.
Damn, you know what? He's basically the kid that my parents would compare me to and they'd want to make me feel bad. You're not studying enough, Saad. You gotta be like Tony. So I just want to dive right in with one thing.
Yeah.
Why this book? Why did you want to create Teaching the Invisible Race?
Yeah, so for me, creating this book, obviously a labor of love, was something that came out of, I want the book that I never had as a teacher, right? This is targeted towards practitioners, teachers primarily, right? Upper elementary, middle school, and high school, humanities, right? Social studies, history, and English and literature, which I've taught all of those, right? So I never had that book going into schools, and I needed a book to help me and other educators understand, how do I enter the conversation? How do I bring my identity into the workplace? And how do I do that well that resonates with, obviously my students are not gonna always match the Asian American diaspora, right? In a predominantly white space, how do I bring in, not just like talk about the negative things that happen to Asian Americans, how do I even let the pro-Asian aspect shine, right?
And you know, out of curiosity, what is, I guess, one of the main goals or objectives of this book? In writing it and in creating this, what do you hope to achieve?
Yeah, so there's a lot I hope to achieve with it, but essentially, I just want foundationally educators first, curriculum specialists and administrators and education researchers to just build their knowledge, their foundational knowledge of how to take, one, Asian American stories, narratives, and histories, and how to translate that into a classroom space. And classroom, I'm talking broadly. It can be in a formal K-12 space. It can be in higher ed. That's why I say schools. Or it can be in an organization, right? And all of those spaces have hired me, like Airbnb, for example, Penn Carey Law School, and then obviously like pre-service teaching programs have hired me to do this book, because what I've noticed, the entire landscape, even after anti-Asian hate in 2020 rising, people still don't know how to really translate this content because they don't have a baseline.
And you know, speaking about the book, I gotta ask you two things. One is, what is your favorite poem from this book?
Yeah, so this book has a lot of poems with it, concepts and reflections. So I'm going to read something, let's see. I'm gonna have to peruse through it really quick.
To give you guys some, I guess, exposition, the reason why I asked this is because as I was skimming through the book myself, I noticed that it has a very unique structure. It's not as you would think of a normal book where it's just words, words, words. They have interviews with other people, activities, reflections, poems, etc. So, as Tony had mentioned before, this book is a real labor of love.
Yeah, I'll read My Filipino, because it's Filipino American History Month now in October, and right? You say that in a moment, right? Filipinos don't know it, Asian Americans don't know it, and if you're not Asian and not Filipino, who's really gonna know that, right? So I teach this a lot. So I'm gonna do this very Filipino poem called My Filipino, after Melissa Lozada Oliva, right? If you ask me if I'm fluent in Filipino, I will tell you. My Filipino is not my anchor, although leagues beneath me, holding its breath. My Filipino breathes in half beats, a language of too many tongues and too many stories to untell. My Filipino is Cavite and Pampanga. My Filipino is my mother and my father, both tongues, captains and captives at the same shipwreck. I am a remix, I am a wreckage. My Filipino is a long-lost gift, the forgotten rudder that pushes someone else's footprint starboard. In the 13th century, it was wrapped up and given a name by the Chinese called the Mai, country of the blacks. In the 16th century, it was given a new name, a truncated one, after King Philip II. My motherland, birthed by a son, Can't spell yourself out of Hispanic without the pronoun his and panicking without his and then intergenerational trauma. Can't seem to be given a name other than El Negrito or El Chinito. To Hispanics, it's a term of endearment. The diminutive, another gift. Fast forward. My Filipino panics in the corner of Mr. Seibert's classroom. My Filipino is given a new name, Phil-Am. Yet it knows that saying the Pledge of Allegiance is like double Dutch with 2 left feet, with no jump, and all rope, and always sinking. Might as well be Filipino aftermath. After so many iterations, a name loses its North Star, and a people lose directions to freedom. A people lose a whole galaxy. If you ask me if I am fluent in Filipino, I will tell you all I remember is nakalimutan. What's left of a ghost of a ghost of a ghost of a ghost of a ghost? What happens to the host? Does language commandeer itself into double erasure? Can phantom limbs speak themselves back into, can phantom limbs speak themselves back? Can phantom limbs speak themselves, can phantom limbs speak? Can phantom limbs, can phantom, or are we just phantoms? Thank you.
Damn, that shit's fucking good, man. You know, I love the fact that because this isn't affiliated with any agency, I could just drop some F-bombs.
Hey,
you know,
let's do it. Let's be real, you know.
We could bleep it, but I am curious, right? With that poem, that really hit me. And I want to ask, what inspired you to add poems to this book? Because if I'm being real with you, looking at this book, I would look at it as, okay, this is going to be an educational text where they'll probably talk about educational reform or changing things up, and it'll be some hoity-toity type shit.
Yeah.
But then I did not expect the poem aspect, the poetry. But it's a very refreshing take, and I want to know why that.
Yo, so when I was talking with my forward author, Liz Kleinrock, who's a badass, like, anti-bias and anti-racist educator, right? Practitioner. This was like in 2019, 2020, around that time, just like freedom dreaming this idea of a book, because I was just inspired. I was like, I have a voice, right? And I was like, what is going to be like my medium and the tool to ground the voice? And I was like, she was like, yo, duh, poetry. Like, this has to be poetry. You're a poet. Like, come on now. I started poetry in undergrad, right? I saw Saul Williams, Bosia. Those are 2 poets who spoke at like Def Jam poetry. I don't know if you know that. I might be dating myself, but that carried me through my high school years and into my undergrad and into like forever, right? Even though it's long gone and done, poets brought me into the work of education, and I wanted to honor that legacy. And then 2, yo, it's emotional work. And I think what people forget about education and books and everything, that there's an emotional component to it. And broadening this idea of intelligence, yo, emotional intelligence. When I used to teach in Indianapolis, in Boston, in Miami, and everywhere, what people forget about BIPOC students, right, and marginalized students, is that how emotionally intelligent they are. And if you're not ready to have that emotional intelligent conversation and strengthen yours, then you ain't ready to teach, right? You're probably just teaching, you're teaching half of what you could be bringing in. So it really, bringing in that poetry is also saying, yo, it's a clarion call for educators and practitioners to bring your full self into the work.
I love that, the clarion call aspect, especially. Speaking of the poetry, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were recently featured on Hulu with your poetry, right?
Yeah.
Walk us through how that happened.
Yo, so for Hulu, which blew my mind, I was nominated for a award called the Community Trailblazer Award for the Asian American Foundation. It's called TAF. It's a new foundation, TAAF, and they support Asian American initiatives from education to public narrative change to research and more, right? And I got nominated by the community, and they're like, the nominator, whoever wins this, or the finalist, gets to get featured in a Hulu episode. And I got nominated by the community, and that's how it happened. Next thing you know, I'm on there doing some poetry and teaching a class in Wisconsin, highlighting the work that I do on a normal basis. So,
man, that's powerful. Now, switching gears, I want to ask you, how do you think your book contributes to the current climate of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that question up because, yeah, it really does. Like, right now as a whole, and that's why I say it speaks to not just K-12 schools and higher ed, and it speaks to like anywhere there's DEI that's needed, which is everywhere, right? There's a lack of knowledge and foundational knowledge of Asian America as a whole, right? Not just schools, not just students and teachers and administrators, it's in corporate America, right? So DEI is everywhere, needed everywhere. And what I'm noticing diversity, we just break down the components, diversity standpoint, which is like diversity of narratives. People don't disaggregate data, and Asian Americans are fighting for that. So we're fighting for a disaggregation of data, meaning we want you to collect data and talk about information about not just East Asian Americans, we want brown Asian Americans. What does that even mean? Filipino Americans are brown. Also, you're a brown Asian American, right? It's different, right? And those communities speak, there's similarities and there are differences. So disaggregating helps us get resources there. Equity, which is like allocation of resources. So now that you disaggregate all that information and that data, we know that my Filipino community and you are Bengali, right? We need different things.
Right.
So we need different funding and different types of just resources as a whole. So on an equity piece, then we can understand how to allocate that funding and resources, whatever resources are there, to our community is very nuanced, right? And then inclusion, how to bring those voices to the table, right? I don't ever see in like strategic planning processes when I'm coaching administrators, us at the table. When we're doing strategic planning for FY whatever, for funding, we're not there. So that inclusive standpoint is there. So at the end of this book, it really talks to administrators too. Like, how do you think about putting us at the table at the front end instead of the back end? And not just putting us to the side, putting us at the center, you know? So DEI, just literally just breaking it down from each terminology is extremely necessary.
So essentially, throughout your research with this book, what is the most enlightening or surprising fact that you've learned about the Asian American experience in the public school system?
Oh my
Or just
goodness,
the school
that's
system
such
at
a hard
large?
question. That's such a big question. But I knew you would be bringing the heat. The most difficult thing, the first thing that comes to mind is what I know. I was saying yesterday, right? I was at Montclair State University doing this talk, right? And what I learned from just, I'm a researcher now, right? So I'm like gathering knowledge from all the public, trying to figure out what's coming out and what's needed. And people just even know how to translate this content. Even if like knowledge is given to people, they don't even know how to translate it and embed it into their everyday because they're not taught that, right? So that is difficult. Another difficult experience is talking about, I'll be straight up honest with you right now, what's relevant right now is Israel and Palestine. And people do not know how to talk about West Asians. And I'm gonna be straight up honest, when I was writing this in the Stop Asian Hate movement, which was rising in 2020, like that was primarily of like Southeast Asians, right? Brown Asians around that time. And what was difficult was I didn't know enough about West Asia. So I didn't include it. I didn't include a lot of it in the book. There's maybe some narratives and policies that impact West Asians and Palestinians specifically. So that has been a difficult conversation to have. Say if we do a second edition, after these last few weeks, I've done kind of like a boot camp for me to learn what's happening because we can't be silent in that conversation, right? Understanding my colonial history from the Philippines and the US like industrial war machine, right? It kind of connects, connects to what's happening now as the US funds a genocide in Palestine, right? So that has been a conversation that has been so difficult just in the public right now, that's at the heart of the work right now. And I'm like, for me, teaching about what a pro-Asian American lens is, it would be remiss for me not to talk about that stuff today.
You know, you mentioned something interesting, right? Now, for those who may not be familiar with this topic, can you just give a little crash course on the history of the Philippines in relation to America?
Yeah, so history of the Philippines in America. So right now, there's a lot happening. I'll give you some moments that I kind of, like when I was going in my socialization around 2018, when I finally took an ethnic studies course, I was like, I did not know this was a time period, right? So I would say, 1587.
Damn. It's like 700
1587.
600 years ago.
1587? Yeah, 1587 is when Spanish galleons, trade ships, enlisted Filipinos as sailors, also enslaved peoples, what I'm learning from scholars. Right? It's 1587.
Right.
Colonizer and the colonized, right? So we really got to be critical about how we marked that narrative. Yeah, they're sailors. Maybe they got paid a little bit, but they're also enslaved people too. Yep. They first came to Morro Bay. And at that time period, this idea, like people mark that as a moment of like, oh, we are the first Asian Americans, right? I've seen a lot of Filipinos and Asian Americans do that. And I think that's important, right? To know, because that makes me proud that we were here before the Pilgrims, you know, like, because people think about the Pilgrims being here as the first people, right? Like in 1700s, I don't know. But to me, Filipinos and the Spanish came there at that time. And arguably, I think some scholars say Chinese people came too earlier at that time. But anyways, if we start with the Philippines, that's around that time. And that is that's a colonial concept of this idea of firsting, like being the first to be somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Let's let that sink, right? And to think about us being the first as a colonized people to another indigenous community, because we got there and the Chumash people were the native indigenous people there. They were not happy that we were there. So they actually killed, I think, a Filipino and a few Spanish colonizers there. And we were not welcome, right? And I know that Filipinos, I think in some readings of history, were trying to build with them, but that wasn't a happy moment, right? So knowing the history that we actually moved south to Louisiana, to St. Malo in the 1700s, in the bayou of Louisiana to build communities there, fishing communities with black folks, right? I think like enslaved black folks moved there as well, right? Escaped slavery to go there and build a community in St. Malo. So you'll see a black Filipino and black community in St. Malo, Louisiana. People don't know about that 1700s. And then obviously the 1800s, the US colonized us after they freed us, quote unquote, from Spain. It was kind of like colonial football.
Right.
And then you go, we had to fight ourselves from the US, also US seeming as a savior, right? They did give us mass resources, right? So we can't go remiss with that. I speak English really well because my family was taught that in the Philippines. In the Philippines, at one point the lingua franca was Spanish, right? For 300 plus years, the Spanish conquered us, right? So the lingua franca at one point was Spanish. Think about this. We're not speaking our native tongues anymore. Or we are, but the main academic tongue or the business tongue was Spanish. Yo puedo hablar en español, because my mom taught me, but then it switched to English. And now I'm trying to trace myself. Writing this book was like kind of tracing myself back to home, to this book. So that kind of outlines kind of some of the historical aspect, and there's a lot more that we can go into, but that's kind of like some of the linear history of the U.S. Before the U.S. became like the U.S., United States, and the U.S. when it became formalized as a nation state in the Philippines. So,
thank you for that, and I feel like that ties in perfectly with the next question, which is, how has your personal experiences and observations influenced your perspectives in this book?
The personal's political. That's the cadence, that's the first part of every chapter. So that's another part. You say, why is there poetry in the book? Why is there personal political? So I always mark a story in the beginning because I want educators to know and to understand one another emotional connection, because it's story, right? So I always add a story to the book. So I'm gonna try to go back to one of them. So let me go back to one that actually I don't share an identity marker with. For example, let me go to chapter 8 on 83, Asian American Queer and Trans Perspectives. So I'll read something here. So the excerpt goes as follows, and the personal is political, right? And this is a poem from Paul Tran. I've lived in in our colonizers' lands. I've spoken my colonizers' language, called myself what they called me, a boy, a he, she, a monster. I'm not here to obey your binary. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to free myself. I'm surrendering myself to the desert wind. I'm surrendering my body to fire. I burn everything I touch as I race to freedom. I mean genderqueer. Genderqueer makes me nobody's son or daughter. Being genderqueer makes me nobody's lover. Paul Tran, an excerpt from a poem, He, She in Button Poetry. So I include this excerpt because it talks about colonization, and I wanted a personal touch to it, but I wanted to bring someone from the community who's also a Southeast Asian American as well, Vietnamese American, poet, educator, author, so much more. And it kind of lends itself into, it brings them into how I conceptualize queer and trans narratives in general and why they're important Asian American narratives to teach. Because here's the thing. People think that if you don't share that narrative that you can't teach about it. I call bullshit on that because we need to, right? Just like Israel and Palestine, I don't share the Palestinian narrative, but people are saying like, don't teach about it. I'm like, no, we need to, because if we let that labor just rely on that group that's being genocided right now, who else is going to teach it? Right. You feel me? Like, we need as many people to teach these things that are marginalized as much as possible, right? So the early messages that came out, and this is like the personal piece, right? So I grew up in a large Filipino family where the term bakla, pronounced as bakla, was often tossed around like colonial football. Bakla translates to gay, gender non-conforming, or third gender in Tagalog. In most cases, the term bakla was said in a derogatory and dehumanizing way, right? So I wanted to unpack that for people and how that was taught to me, right? What does it do to the psyche, right? It makes you think that every time bakla is thrown, or anyone from the bakla community or third gender community is a negative thing. And actually, moving forward, there's this, in pre-colonial Philippines, there's these people called the Baybaylans, right? And they were our shamans and chieftains, right? So you go back to pre-colonial work, these are shamans and chieftains that led our tribes. They were leaders in our community, right? Like, that was not taught to us, to Filipinos. So to me, part of me going into that history, weaving in like the trans queer community and identities and histories, and then me finding myself in that, right? You know, my pronouns are he, they, and sha because I've been taught to be he only, but sha is gender neutral, right? What does it mean to not have a gender and be non-binary? It's hard because I've been taught to be masculine, and not to conflate the two, but I've been taught to be hyper-masculine, right? So that toxic masculinity comes out, and that's me kind of combating that, is teaching about that and weaving in that narrative. And like personal stories with my family and how that came out, because I got people who are identified as quote-unquote bakla in my book, in my family. Like, if I'm not teaching about that, because I bring my family in here too, then what does that say about me and my family members? How I treat them, how I love them, right? And people, my students, right? My students often, like, people in today's age, I think youth today are a lot more inclusive. And we need to catch up with them. You know what I'm saying? So this book and that part of being personal really helps us excavate. And this, there's a scholar here at Columbia University, Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz, talks about the archaeology of self, right? I love that terminology, right? She popularized that term, even though it's done before. But how to excavate yourself to understand that within you, there's a knowledge. Within your community and your history, there is a knowledge that's both personal and political, and how that can connect with audience members that you don't even know, right? And I think that's powerful.
You know, that brings up 2 points in my head. One being, I think Native Americans have this term called like twin spirit, or something of that nature. Two-spirit, that's what it was. So that's what that reminded me of. But the second thing is, when you're talking about the term, you said bakla. So you said sometimes it'd be used in a derogatory way, and it reminds me of when I was a kid and I was in Bangladesh. I don't know, maybe I was like 7, 6, and I was around a genderqueer community. But for reference, Bangladesh is a very Muslim country, right? So they frown upon things of that nature. And when I was around that crowd, they said a term, like my extended family over there, called Hezra. which
Hezra?
was Hezra, right? Which is like a similar, like you're saying, a derogatory term for that. And I never understood why that was the case. But then as I got older, I realized that, well, words have power, and sometimes people are just scared of things that they don't understand.
That's it. You zoom out, and like, yes, words have power, and then at the end of the day, can be similar as like if you don't understand it, you fear it, right? And that's a big learning component that just translates outside of Asian America too.
It's interesting. So I want to ask you, right? In writing this book, what was one of your biggest challenges, and how have you overcome it?
Yeah, one of the most difficult things. Let me look as well when I think about the challenges of this. Just balancing how big Asian America is. Let me just.
I always tell people, man, Asia's a huge fucking continent.
I know, yo. Let me just be honest with you, and then I want to be honest with you. Asia is humongous, and I'm gonna read because earlier we talked about this, and you flipped to it, and you're like, let me see what Asians are. Who does this book center, right? This book centers the narratives of Asian Americans, specifically East, South, and Southeast, because of my knowledge of those communities, right? For clarity, East Asian refers to mainland China, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, and more, right? South Asia refers to Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, with Afghanistan also included, right? Southeast Asia refers to the Philippines, Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Brunei, East Timor, Timor-Leste. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly. Myanmar, Singapore, and Thailand, right? It's me like knowing what I don't know about these communities, and I'm like, did I highlight enough? Like that's part of me. But I always come back to the point of like that's not the point. The point is the concepts behind the book, because there's a lot of books that teach history and the content and very academic and very much like every narrative. This book is not the purpose of teaching every narrative. It's to show that we do need to look and do research and know and expand our horizon of what it means. And it's almost not impossible, but it's to acknowledge the difficulty to know all of these things, because we're the biggest like racial group growing in the country right now, right? And the U.S. education system has not caught up, right? So me trying to write this book was to catch up with what I don't know and to catch up with other communities, right? So that's one challenge of the book. And then, I think even when I was interviewing for this book, already being published, right? The title, Teaching the Invisible Race. Me being challenged by a few scholars. Like one of my favorite scholars, friend, is Dr. Rose Ann Gutierrez, who wrote an entire chapter on Undocu Asian America, which I'm not really familiar with that because I haven't done that excavating myself with my family, right? And then Filipino undocumented peoples. She even critiqued the title of this book and saying that invisibility is probably not a strong enough framework, and we should call this omission, because invisibility is more passive. Whereas omission is more intentional, is an active process of omitting someone. And that was like, ooh, that sung with me. I was like, oh, that challenged me a lot. And I'm so glad to my sister, Maraming Salamat, because this is what pushes our scholarship and our community engaged work to make it better and more sticky, right? Stickier.
Perfect, man. Now, the penultimate question that I have to ask you is, in what ways do you hope this book will influence and impact students, educators, and policymakers?
Yeah, at first, I hope it does help build a foundational piece, right? Like I said, when I do my landscape analysis and reassessment, I research policy. I research Asian American ethnic studies policy and where it's being built across different states, right? Around 5+ states have adopted it so far, and then 10 to 15 are fighting for it right now. I hope it gives them the language and the tools, the mindsets and ways of being of how to approach it, right? Through a critical lens, right? Not just to surface level say, hey, here's your history, cool. History's political, so you have to teach it and ask the right questions. So, cool, Filipinos came at 1587, so what next?
Right.
Why is that a problem, right? Why shouldn't we should celebrate aspects of it, or should we? Should we not? And how should we teach it, right? Those critical questions, right? Oh, during the ethnic studies movement in 1960s. Asians existed with the Black community, with the Latinx community, right? So modeling what people think about Asian America, we're just in our little bubbles, right? And then lastly, there are Black, Blasian, Asians out there, right? We don't want to erase the very real intersectional narratives of Asian American identities, disabled Asian Americans, right? Like queer, trans, disabled, Blasian narratives. We're just hitting the surface, friend, with this book, right? So again, if I do a second edition, third edition, like when I do my portraits in the book, because there's a chapter of just portraits, like I can't wait to include so much more. Maybe yours in the future, that would be dope. Like, but more, like just more like that complicate people's ideas of what Asian Americans are, who they are, and who are leading. Because when we think about them, we still think about pop culture. We still think about, people still do a bad job. Education is everywhere, right? And people get it from pop culture. They see Simu Liu, they see Michelle Yeoh from Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? And it's just the surface, right? We need to go down to the ground, the activists, the people who are just the invisible of the invisible. And that's what I want people to understand in this book. There's the invisible within the invisible within the invisible. And I want you to disaggregate that. And I really want you to go into the rabbit hole of who those people are, what those stories are, to really fill in that gap for yourself.
And you know, one thing I want to mention is you were talking about the bubble aspect.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a very important thing to mention because intersectionality is a huge piece.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about a couple decades ago when they had the LA riots. And you had the Koreans actually helping the African American community at that time, perched upon like rooftops with snipers and everything during that point. But then a lot of this is erased throughout time, and you think, each community is in their own little bubble. But then when you really delve deep into it, you realize how deep the roots of its intersectionality actually runs.
Oh, yeah. That movement, the movement in Detroit, Black Asian solidarity, and solidarity not out of contention and fight, right? Solidarity is hard. And that's the purpose of chapter, I think, 6, which is Isang Baksak as an ed framework. That's my own research. Really is to highlight those movements and those moments of those cross-intersectional, cross-racial narratives, but to also like say, hey, don't think that teaching this is an easy thing. Like, you're gonna get some pushback, because as I was learning and excavating where these came from, like interviewing some people from the movements, I was being corrected. I was being saying, hey, like, you need to teach it through this lens. Oh, you need to uplift this voice. And that's important. Any scholar, any research scholar, any educator, because it teaches us consent. And that's another thing I want people to get, is like to approach the Asian American community with consent. That you don't know it all, because every time I go and meet people who try to talk about Asian American who are excited, many of them wish to be non-Asians. And they had to been married to an Asian. And I'm like, oh, where is this going? You know, I'm a public servant, so I'm like I want to just withhold my bias too. But to be able to call them in and be like, hey, so I'm glad that you're excited about it, and I want to push back. You know, and I want other people to do that in public, in a way with compassion and love, so that they learn and they stick with learning instead of like canceling them, right? We're not going to move forward if we cancel everybody, right? So this is broader stuff, right?
Of course.
But I want people to lead with and teach about Asian Americans with that inclusive, compassionate mindset that is critical, that is like, it pushes people to go deep within themselves, and then to wrestle with it, because we need everybody. This is a collective movement.
Now, man, I really appreciate this conversation. And I'm moving on to the final question I want to ask you, and this is going to be a personal question, but if you could talk to Tony at the beginning of the journey to create this book, where you're at right now, what would you tell him?
Oh, Tony, dear Tony. Dear Tony, it's okay if it's not perfect. I lost sleep over this book. You know what I'm saying? Like, I lost so much sleep over this book, trying to get it correct, the perfect thing. And it was so difficult to get out of that perfectionist mindset that's also tied to the model minority myth of like trying to be white.
I feel you on that.
And try to be perfect in all things Asian American, right? So that was something that I want younger Tony, like literally 2 years ago, Tony, 2.5 years ago, Tony, to know is that it's like lean into the imperfections, because that is a conversation in and of itself, right? That's a whole pedagogy of leaning into the perfections, right? What's another thing? Dear Tony, I wish you knew a little bit more about what's happening today, about what's the movement right now, which is to say, my chapter on chapter 7 on settler colonialism still opens up a gate for that conversation to flow, right? So even if I don't have that content about Palestine and Israel and West Asians, the conversation still talks and speaks to movements. So I'm proud of you, Tony, that you're already risking yourself to get this work in the world and planning yourself to be in public spaces with this work and not just writing for academics. You're writing for people who are truly on the ground, working with our most vulnerable populations, youth, right? Who don't have voting rights, right? Who are intersectional, disabled, queer and trans, you name it, right? They hold those narratives, and they're really just looking for models to show us what, like, global citizenship. Sorry, our youth are looking for global models to model after, to like look after, right? And to show that they have power too, right? Part of this is also power sharing, right? So, dear Tony, you did a good enough job, and good is good enough at this point. And I hope that, this is not just book one. This is not just like the final book. This leads into other avenues to get other Asian Americans and broadly cross-racial solidarity work out there, because I think that's one of the biggest issues of our time is not being able to talk to strangers, right? Daniel Allen, who's a scholar in democracy, has a book called Talking to Strangers. And what I learned through this process is that we really need better frameworks to talk to strangers, to bring them in compassionately, to hold them in tension compassionately and not canceling them, and to move forward together. And change happens at the speed of trust. We know this, right? Trust is a slow process. And I want people to know that slow cooking is the best cooking.
Thank you for that, Tony, and thank you for the wonderful, wonderful conversation. With that being said, I do want to offer you the chance to, if you have any final words to the audience, please feel free.
So if you can check out this book, please do. It just launched in October. October's Philippine American History Month, so it's very salient right now. And for those who already purchased it, thank you so much for investing in the work. And of course, lastly, isang bagsak. It's a term. I want you to say it with me. Isang bagsak.
Isang bagsak.
Isang bagsak, which it means one down in Tagalog. And that came out of the anti-martial law movement to fight against the Marcos regime. And that really is an embodiment of cross-racial solidarity. So again, isang bagsak, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Tony. And he's a little bit more humble than I am, so I'll just say make sure you buy this amazing book, because I've had a chance to skim it, and just by skimming it, I already noticed that the structure that it has is very unique compared to other books in its genre. So with that being said, Isak Bang. I fucked it up.
Let's say it together.
All right, perfect. And then that's all end off. All right, how do we say it again?
Isang bagsak.
Okay, ready? 3, 2.
Isang bagsak.
Take care, guys.